Okay, so I think we are ready to start. Thank you for coming to the panel. The presentation of the World Development Report on Governance and the Law. My name is Carlos Bosch, and I teach here at the Woodrow Wilson School. And it's a pleasure to have here not the whole team, because it was a very big team, but part of the team, and a team that has worked on this report for a long time, and led by Luis Felipe Lopez Calva, who is here with us and who is going to present the report to all of us, and then also by Young Mei Zhu, who has not been able to join us. And then, as I said, the team is a very big one, with a set of leaders working on each chapter, and one of the chapters was basically led by Ezequiel Molina, who is here with us and who is one of our own. He graduated in 2013 from the Woodrow Wilson School. So it's a pleasure having you here. And let me just say, it's an act of propaganda, I guess, that part of the report has also had the advice of several of the faculty in Princeton, Tom Fujiwara, and Leo Wanchikan, and myself. We tried our best to help, and I think the product is a wonderful one, and I sort of encourage all of you to read it. So the way we are going to proceed is that Luis Felipe is going to talk and present the report for about 30 minutes, 35 minutes. Professor Widener, also from the Woodrow Wilson School and the Politics Department, has been very gentle and generous with her time to come and comment on the report. I'll add a few things, and then we'll open everything to a question and answer and a discussion with all of you. So thank you so much for being here.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much to Carles and to the Woodrow Wilson School for having us here to present the report, and thank you very much to Professor Widener for accepting to be discussing today. The WDR is a main flagship report of the World Bank. So I would like to start with a brief, sort of very succinct description of what a WDR attempts to achieve. Not all of them achieve that, and we are in the process of working hard to put this in the public conversation, and we don't know if we will achieve that goal. But we can think of WDRs as World Development Reports as one. When the bank puts together a team, and the idea is to take stock of what we have learned about a specific theme, in the last 20 years or so. And ideally, if we do a good job, the idea will be to create a framework to put what we know. So in that sense, what you will see is not something that is new in the scientific sense. We actually put together a lot of material that is already there, but we try to do it in a way that shapes the way we think about this issue, hopefully for the next 10, 15, 20 years. So if the first way to assess the report, I would say, is whether we are actually capturing what we have learned about the issue in the last 20 years or so. The second only time will tell is whether we actually manage to reshape the way the policy world thinks about some of the issues in the report. So on that, through that, let's try to start from there and tell you that what we want to always, the way we motivate the presentation is that at the end, as development practitioners, the main focus of the report is how to make policies more effective. So in a way, we are going to look at governance and law from the perspective of how we can make, or how can we understand why some policies are more effective than others, and how we can improve in this, in terms of achieving development outcomes. As you will see throughout the presentation, we try to emphasize this idea of form versus function as a central element of the report, in the sense that there has been a lot of discussion in the development community about best practices, in the sense of, looking at what type of institutions some countries should have, and try to, look at those best practices and try to push for reforms that encourage countries to adopt that kind of institutions. What we say is, before we go into what form of institutions you have to pursue, you have to understand what is the functional problem that you are facing. And there might be different forms to achieve the specific function in a way that will be hopefully clearer after the presentation. A very important element of the report is that this functional effectiveness sometimes is thwarted by what we call in the report power asymmetries, the distribution of power in society. We always motivate by saying that in our institution, and in general among economists, or among many economists, when you talk about power, people can only think of electricity. It is really, in the bank, it is really not at the center of the discussion how, the relative bargaining power of actors can influence the potential success in terms of policy effectiveness. So we try, we will judge if we achieve that goal, but what we try to do is to try to put a little bit of macroeconomic structure to the idea of why power matters to, get in the way of functional effectiveness in terms of the achievement of development goals. And finally, we try to argue that even though these processes are very persistent, there is actually change. And the idea that basically every society faces distributional tensions over time. Development is an uneven process. It generates tensions. And the way you adapt at the margin to those tensions is what explains which path you follow as a society. So it is very important to understand how you adapt at the margin to the tensions that the development process brings about. So let me tell you three types of questions that we try to address. One is why ineffective policies persist. We see, this is just one example. This is about energy subsidies. We have others, like, for example, low property taxes in the case of Latin America or in other developing countries. So policies that we, from a technical perspective, the empirical evidence tells us that they are not efficient, they lead to inefficiencies, and they lead to inequities. And yet, they are very difficult to change. Second type of questions is why certain policies that are technically well designed don't work. So we have the case, for example, of teacher absenteeism, and then you will see how there are many contractual forms have been tried, many organizational forms have been tried, yet teacher absenteeism is very persistent in many developing countries. Finally, we see many solutions that from the technical perspective are not necessarily ideal, and yet they produce results. And we show many examples of that. So, here in this case, we just show the case of the climate change agreement, how, for a long time there was this idea, what was the optimal distribution of the commitments in terms of climate change, and what was the way that countries should commit to specific goals. Eventually, they decided to do a very different thing, which is countries voluntarily commit to a specific goal, and then the agreement was reached in a very positive, successful way. So sometimes we are trying to find the technically best way to do things, and sometimes there are, sort of second best solutions. One colleague in the bank said that this report, in a way, tries to legitimize the second best. There are three typical answers that if you talk to development practitioners, they tell you when you look at why policies fail. One is, policies fail because you didn't follow best practice. The other is policies fail because there was lack of capacity. The other is policies fail because there was no political will. What we argue in this report is that these answers are not enough or are not acceptable. We have to go deeper and try to understand why things that work in a specific context don't work in a different context. Why capacity is not built. Capacity is a stock that is the result of policy decisions in the past. So why capacity is not built so that certain policies are more effective. And finally, we have to understand better what is the configuration of incentives and how at the margin you can try to influence those incentives to bring about change. So basically, the report acknowledges upfront that many issues related to governance have intrinsic value. We say that at the very beginning, but then we move into a very instrumental approach in the sense we want to assess governance from the perspective of how it is effective to achieve certain goals. So the only dimension that we can consider more normative in the report is when we say that every society cares about freeing their citizens from the threat of violence, from violence or the threat of violence. Every society cares about prosperity, and every society cares about distributing this prosperity in a way that is equitable. These are the three main goals, and that is the space, the normative space of the report. Then from there, we're going to analyze how policies are effective to achieve those goals by looking at the governance that leads to that effectiveness. Okay, so the fact that we have these three, which are security, growth, and equity, doesn't mean that in many cases there will not be trade-offs, and we discussed that. In many cases, you have to the prioritization among these objectives has to be also very context dependent. A very important thing in the report is that we don't look at institutions as abstract entities and how they evolve over time, or as entities that are very persistent and change very little over time. We want to focus on actors. And this is a very important thing for the whole approach in the report. We focus on actors and how actors reach and sustain agreements. And then we look at policies and institutions as the result of those interactions among the actors. So in that sense, governance involves not only government actors or state actors, but also non-state actors. And the issue here is how they bargain, they reach agreements and sustain them, is that what will explain the effectiveness or not of specific policies. So in that sense, and this is an important departure from the way the good governance agenda has been discussing these issues in the last 20 years or so, the idea that what we care about here is how actors, state and non-state actors, reach agreements. That means that governance is not government only. Governance goes beyond that. And the space in which the actors bargain and reach those agreements, we call it the policy arena. Okay? So these are sort of the essential elements of the approach. And then we say, well, what is that we observe that makes policies more effective in terms of this approach to governance? So we say, well, it is important that the agreements among actors can be sustained over time. Even when circumstances change and so on, if there is a long-term objective, there is no departure from the agreement. The second is that all the actors involved are willing to comply with what emerges from that bargain. Okay? So there is a bargaining process, the rules are set, and people are willing to comply voluntarily. And finally, it has to be done in a way that policies can create shared expectations so they lead to the optimal actions from people in terms of savings, investment, innovation, and so on. Okay? So the first of them is what we call commitment, the second is what we call cooperation, and the third is what we call coordination. So these are the three types of functions that we care about in terms of the agreements actors reach, so that we can have more effective policies in the long term. However, commitment, cooperation, and coordination can break down when some actors have more influence in that bargaining process. Okay? And these are the power asymmetries that we bring into the discussion. And we emphasize three particular manifestations of those power asymmetries that we and the literature calls capture, which is not only, but it's particularly relevant for growth, clientelism, which is particularly relevant for equity, and finally exclusion, that we argue can be particularly relevant for security. So these manifestations of power asymmetries are going to lead to a breakdown of the functional effectiveness. So the presentation doesn't do full justice to the discussion of law in the report, because but I would like to say a few things about how we see the issue of law in the report, because we say governance and law. So what we say, and the chapter is deliberately called the role of law, to contrast with the discussion about the rule of law. As you know, all societies aspire to the idea of the rule of law, in the sense that rules are applied impersonally, and the rulers are also subject to the rules. However, we claim in the report, this rule of law is a norm in itself. It's a shared belief that that's the way rules should be applied. In order to achieve that goal, we have to understand what are the different roles of law. Law orders power. Law can be used as a tool for contestation, and law can coordinate and can be a focal point to order behavior. So if we can strengthen the different roles of law, we argue, we can eventually move in the direction of achieving what is called the rule of law. We cite actually former Prime Minister Gordon Brown, who says, when implementing the rule of law, the first 500 years are always the hardest. Because it's a constant struggle. So one of the elements that shapes the policy arena is precisely formal law. So we typically do, and certainly in the bank, and you may know this, but we try to change laws. That's the way in which you try to reshape behavior and try to reshape the policy arena. And what we say is, well, we have to be very aware that formal law is just one of the elements or one of the aspects that shapes the policy arena. So formal law interacts with customary law, social norms, international treaties, many other normative frameworks that can actually lead to effective change in behavior. So basically the point here is that by changing formal law, do not necessarily you can expect a change in behavior. We have just one example. We have many in the report. This is about gender quotas. So the first case is Bangladesh, that in the blue dot is when they incorporated the gender quota in politics, and when they fulfilled the quota. So it took more than 20 years to fulfill that quota. In other cases like Korea, there is a law, but it has not been implemented as of 2015. And all these dots in these countries show countries that have this law, but the law has not been actually implemented. So this notion of the implementation gaps, try to understand what explains why the change in law is not really a change in behavior. It's an important element that we try to discuss in the report. And part of the point is precisely you want to shape behavior to lead to better commitment, to more capacity to coordinate, and to more cooperation among agencies. By the way, we link the idea of cooperation very closely to the idea of legitimacy, in the sense that, as we understand legitimacy, is the notion of voluntary compliance with authority. So basically, the fact that the process that leads to specific rules and policies matters as much as what is the policy that you adopt. Just one quick, a bit more technical detour is that we wanted to, when we talk about coordination, cooperation, and commitment, we explained that we wanted to differentiate. In the case of cooperation and coordination particularly, is that cooperation refers basically to prisoner's dilemma type of game, in which, as we know, the socially desirable outcome is only sustained through repeated interaction, through third-party enforcement. So if, for example, in this game, x is greater than 2, basically you are going to have one equilibrium in which basically let me see. Yeah. So this if there is a coordination game, which is when x is lower than 2, you have these two equilibria, and the idea is how you coordinate to move to an equilibrium that in principle can be Pareto preferred, but actually if x is larger than 2, then you will be basically stuck in an equilibrium that is a typical prisoner's dilemma. So what we wanted to do, in a very simple way, is to try to differentiate between these two, because one is about trying to move agents to a different type of action that once they are in that action, that is an equilibrium. The other is one in which you want to prevent free riding from certain individuals. So these are the two different types of functions that we're talking about. This is one example of what we want to illustrate through the commitment discussion in terms of form versus function. It's a very interesting case that we discussed in chapter 2. This is the procyclical management of public spending in Mongolia versus Chile. The interesting case here, this is how the change in revenues from exports and how this is the change in expenditures, and a more pronounced slope here means that you are more pro-cyclical in terms of the use of your revenues. So Mongolia had these windfall revenues from natural resource extraction, and they said, well, we have to do something to save for the future and so on. So they brought experts from Chile, and of course the bank helped them bring experts from Chile, and they literally copied the rules of the fund, the sovereign wealth fund or the rainy day fund that they put in place in Mongolia. So the reason why we wanted to contrast these two is because the rules behind this are exactly the same. Yet, in Mongolia, expenditure is much more procyclical, and not only that, but 2 years ago they went into a fiscal crisis that led them to ask for budget support again after 10 years of very high revenues. Okay, so the idea that exactly the same form leads to very different type of function forces us to understand, try to understand better what is behind this, and to try to understand that just by bringing best practices into a different context, you cannot necessarily solve the problem. This is an example that could be better explained by Ezequiel, because he's the one who was leading the work on these lab experiments. But basically, the idea was to do different types of governance experiments in which there were some contributions and then redistribution, and try to see when there was kind of cheap talk type of interaction between the agents versus more serious commitment that was costly for the individual that was redistributing the resources. And we can see that when there is more credible commitment, you actually get lower income for the person redistributing the money, and higher income for those citizens. I think, is that correct, Ezequiel? Okay. So that is the example of in lab experiments in which we did very similar. I mean, several types of cases in which in one, for example, the person that would redistribute the money was elected by the others, in another was appointed, and then we introduced some type of cheap talk, some type of more credible commitment, and we saw what was the result in terms of the cooperation, the contributions of the agents, and the level of redistribution, okay? And one of the results is how the commitment actually leads to more contributions and more redistribution. But when we are talking about these, these functions like commitment, cooperation, and so on, we argue in the report, we encounter this idea that there are actors with more influence in the policy arena. So the idea that exclusion, capture, and clientelism can affect the effectiveness of policy can be illustrated by many empirical studies that we show in the report, but also, and this is something that I will mention at the end, the idea that not only empirical studies in a specific country or cross-country, but also the idea that you want to understand the historical trajectory of a country itself. So one exercise we did with the Varieties of Democracy group in Sweden was to have this expert survey. And for different countries, this is just one snapshot in one moment in time, in different countries, who participates in the policy process. So there are many other types of combinations that you can look at the data, and this is, again, with all the weaknesses of an expert survey. But basically, the idea is that in some countries, there are many more actors participating in the policy process. In some countries, basically, it's perceived that very few actors are participating in the policy process. So in a way, this tells us something can be associated to contestability of the policy arena, even though it's not necessarily, I mean, this is more related to inclusion or to more participation in the policy arena. What we argue is that inclusion per se is not what you would like to have. What you would like to have is lower barriers of entry. So all those actors who would like to participate for certain reasons in the policy arena should have the instruments to do it, not necessarily that more actors leads to better outcomes. This is the case of Brazil, in which different actors have played a very different role over time. So you can see here that in some cases, for example, the military had a lot of power for a certain period, and then it goes down, and other actors have, there is a lot of variation of which actors have more influence over time. Incidentally, the international organizations have a pretty stable influence over time. This example you must know very well. This is the Fishman paper on Suharto's, during the Suharto era, to try to illustrate and put up economic value in this, when we talk about capture, the idea that firms that were very closely connected with the Suharto regime were losing value in the stock market as Suharto's health was deteriorating, and firms that were unrelated to the regime had just normal stock price fluctuations. And this, in a way, this tells us how the market itself was valuing the political connections. This is just one very rough association, but we thought it's an illustration of the idea of how commitment can be associated with concentration of wealth. This is just concentration of wealth at the top, as reported in the Forbes data set, associated with our measure of commitment that has to do basically with contract enforcement and regulatory commitment, and there is a negative association. So the higher the concentration at the top in a society in terms of wealth, the lower the capacity of commitment that we as measured by this indicator. Finally, the issue of clientelism. We look at two types of clientelism. I'm at 25 minutes. I'm going to try to do 7 more minutes, and then we'll try to finish. There are two different types of clientelism. One is when we call accountability for sale. Basically, the idea that the vote, instead of an instrument of accountability, becomes a transaction. So basically, you are willing to exchange your vote for a short-term benefit instead of turning it into an instrument of accountability. This is one of the examples that we observe, and we give examples of how that leads to the breakdown of commitment with outcomes. And the other is when officials are accountable to specific actors in society, but not to all of them, because these actors could be, for example, financing the campaigns or getting the politicians elected. So the case, for example, of the teacher absenteeism, what we see is a very clear example of this, when actually teacher unions get the politicians elected, and that way they can get away with not showing up to teach. Let me skip this. This is just one example of what we have the discussion in the growth chapter, where our point is that there is no such thing as a middle income trap, in the sense that the trap is not associated with the fact that you are middle income. What we say is you want to transit from a growth model based on factor accumulation or on extraction of resources to a growth model driven by innovation and productivity. And our point is that the type of institutional adaptation that you need to transit from one type of growth model to the other, if that adaptation doesn't take place, you get trapped. But it doesn't matter whether you are low, high, or middle income, you can get trapped on that. And actually, Europe, in a way, is facing this type of issue when we think about, particularly Eastern Europe, when we think about how to bring about more innovation, productivity. There are issues related to institutional adaptation that you need, that if it doesn't take place, you cannot move. And what you see, it's okay. What you see is that when we see countries that manage to get out of the trap, in the sense that, for example, where low income and manage to get to higher levels of income, when you look at the indicators of public sector corruption, judicial constraints on the executive, CSO, all those who manage to escape also are doing better in terms of these indicators. So there seems to be some association again. The endogeneity here is everywhere, but there seems to be an association between this adaptation to institutional adaptation and the capacity to move into a more productivity-led growth. Quickly, the part of, we emphasize that change is actually possible. So what we say is typically we focus on what we call, on this part, this side of the graph, that we call the outcome game. So typically you see, okay, certain policies lead to certain outcomes. This can redistribute power in this arena, and you get in this loop. But what we say is that actors in this policy arena can also agree to change the rules, and this is what we call the rules game. And the rules game can actually also redistribute power and eventually lead to a better dynamics. And in a way, what you have is this very persistent endogenous process. But again, we really want to challenge the idea that you have societies that are open access versus limited access, or extractive versus inclusive. What we say is that societies have certain elements of them that are more inclusive, certain elements that are more extractive. And the idea is precisely how you adapt, as I said at the beginning, how you adapt at the margin to the different tensions, what leads you in one path or the other. The three elements that are important to understand change is how incentives change, how preferences and beliefs change over time, and how contestable is the policy arena. In order to, this is a puppet you know very well, which is the case of Brazil, in which we are it's a case of this contestability and incentives, in the sense that by bringing more actors, as important voters through this new technology, you actually change the outcomes in terms of policy, because you had to be more responsive. We show examples like that. Then finally, we discuss the role of elites, citizens, and international actors in promoting change. We look at how elites can bring about change by restricting their own power, and there are many examples, there are many reasons of that. How, for example, if there is more competition among elites may want to restrict the power of the others, so when they are in power, the power is not used against them. So this idea of restricting power as an insurance mechanism. The other is restricting power to legitimize themselves, but in a way, and this links to the discussion, what I mentioned about the role of law. There are changes in law that apparently are only form, but eventually can be used by some actor to challenge, to contest. And this is where change can be possible. So that is why I think looking at these elite bargains is very important. Second, we look at the four different types of instruments that citizens have to influence change: voting, political organization, social organization, and public deliberation. And we claim in the report that all of them matter, and actually over time societies may rely more on one or the other. So in cases where there is issue with the electoral system, where there are lack of representation of political organizations, then it becomes more important to do social organization and deliberation. So the idea that you have all these channels, you should have all these channels open, is a key element in our discussion of adaptation. So if you have all these channels open, societies may be able to adapt better to these distributional tensions in more inclusive ways. If these channels are closed, then the tensions could lead to violence or could lead to more extractive type of adaptation. Finally, one point I want to make on international actors, and with this I finish, is that we try to put aside the discussion of whether aid is good or bad. We actually say, international aid or development assistance, saying that whether it's good or bad is not the right question. I think all the papers that look at this cross-country effect, we don't really care about what is the average effect of foreign aid. What we say is, from this perspective, what you have to understand is that through the international instruments, what you are doing when you intervene in a country is that you are strengthening the bargaining power of specific actors or changing the relative power in the domestic arena. So change can only come from an agreement in the domestic arena. You cannot induce change from the outside. But you can influence the relative power of actors in the domestic arena. And if the intervention reinforces the equilibrium that led to the outcome that you wanted to change, it's very unlikely that you will actually promote change. So the idea is to understand when you are intervening in a country with specific instruments, whose bargaining power you are actually affecting through that intervention. With this I close. So I'm going to say these are the four main aspects of the report, and I hope it was a very quick overview of many things, so we'll have time to discuss in the Q&A. One is governance is about actors and how they reach agreements, and institutions and policies are the result of those agreements. Governance is a process. Finally, countries, in a way from this perspective, can ultimately only be compared to themselves. So, of course, benchmarking is useful and it helps, but we argue that we spend too much time in this benchmarking and little time in understanding historical trajectories of countries and try to understand what is the nature of the change that is possible at a given point in time. And finally, the idea that countries, systematically all countries face these distributional tensions that are the result of the process of development, and the adaptation at the margin is what explains long-term trajectories. Thank you.
So, thanks very much for inviting me to comment. My name is Jennifer Widener. I run a program called Innovations for Successful Societies here at Princeton, and in 2008 we began to try to chip away at the same research agenda, so I think that's how I got invited to do this, because we had talked very, very early on in this process. At the risk of making the comments a little baroque, I'm making some last-minute changes in these. So I thought I'd just begin with a little description of a project we're working on, because I think it's the aim of helping us is something that the report has in mind. And then I want to just work through a couple of things that drew my attention as we went through this. So just a first word up front, what do we do here and how does this relate to this report? We take about 4 or 5 questions each year, and we try to probe how countries or subnational units in different parts of the world have managed to succeed, where others have not, in implementing some changes that improve institutional effectiveness. So essentially, we've got the same kind of research agenda. How do you actually get implementation of policies, and how do you design those policies so that they're more effective? So one example of that is that right now we're working on a series about the implementation of national anti-corruption strategies. Under the UN Convention Against Corruption, each country that's a signatory has to come up with a strategy or something that looks a little bit like a strategy. And then there's peer review, so they have to come back and show how far they've gone with this. So we sort of know which ones are struggling and which have made some progress. And then we had some sense up front that how you got some traction on this, if we looked at the countries that were off the line, that they'd actually done better than others, we hypothesized that their strategies would be a little different, the tactics would be a little different depending upon a variety of things, including the underlying configuration of power. And so we're working in some places that are in the headlines right now. Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, Ghana, Mauritius, and a number of others. And I'm happy to talk about how they differ, but I'm going to make some references to them as we go along. It's a hot subject everywhere. They've made some progress, but as you say, it's a dynamic game. So you find a solution, and then the people who are most affected will find a way around. So I wanted to, if I can figure out how to get this to work, I don't want to necessarily go over the same material. So I'm going to wear two hats here. I'm going to talk a little bit about this from my ISS, Innovations for Successful Societies, Global Delivery Initiative hat, because we assisted the World Bank a little bit in the early stages of that. And then I'm going to switch back to the political science hat, since that's my home discipline. And I'm going to offer a takeaway. But I think it's pretty clear up front in the report, countries need to rethink how to go about designing and implementing policies. Very often they just get stuck there. And to quote another Brit, Tony Blair once said, the problem is not the vision, the problem is getting things done. And that's where a lot of this started. So I don't know why this is not quite showing, but we'll go with it anywhere. Governance in the report is defined as design and implementation to boost security, growth, and equity. There are three broad drivers of effectiveness laid out in the report, which are clusters of what I would call strategic problems or big political science concepts. They're clustered under commitment, coordination, and cooperation. One might add to that list, but those are the three that are pulled out. Tactics are shaped, the successful tactics, the kinds of things we're studying in our program, are shaped primarily in the view of the report by the underlying balance of power, and that is in some measure proxied by the degree of capture, clientelism, exclusion. And then there are three broad types of strategies. We would call them tactical repertoires, and we break them down a little bit more, but there are three broad strategies in the view of the report, some focusing on elite bargains, some on citizen engagement, and some on international intervention. I'm going to skip around a little bit here. So I'm going to go back to my political science hat in a minute, and I'm going to go back to what happened to the law. And we'll skip over this and go to the ISS hat. So our objective was somewhat similar to that in the report, although we're a bit more at the coalface. We're really a bit more down on the ground. So the aim is to help practitioners take politics and learning into account and trying to improve the probability that policies will get implemented. And the framework used in the report, the recommended framework for practitioners, I think, is very similar to the one we use. So there's a development challenge that's identified up front, and that's the diagnosis, and that is in the early, what I just showed you. You assess the type of asymmetry of I think the GDI, the Global Delivery Initiative, and we might call a delivery challenge, but this is the kind of objections key actors might have. So that's what you got to get around. Then identify some entry points, and you have three broad ones: contestability, incentives, preferences, and beliefs. Then you build a coalition, and to try to act on these, and then you see how far you got, and you adapt. And that seems to me to be what the recommendation for practitioners is, just as a process in the report. And somewhat similar to what our case studies do. You can find those up on the web, and they all have a standard form. And one of the nice things about the report is that it says we're going to back away from best practice, and we're going to talk about best fit. In our program, we call this tactical repertoires that are suited to context. But the aim is to find the tactics that will best accomplish this within a given domain. we're going to go back to that. So now the political science hat. In the main, I think this report is a very conventional political science statement. It is very much rooted in the pluralist political tradition in political scientists. That is, science, policy results from bargaining in a political arena that we all know about, and it's sensitive to the resources players bring to the table. This kind of view of politics goes way, way back. And people, by and large, kind of vote their interests. They're calculating. This is defined mainly on a single dimension. The states are the main unit here, although I think they'd be willing to back away from that a little bit. But I don't think it's that strong an emphasis. But there's a lot of emphasis on states here. But in the report, there are also hints of a different kind of view. There's a reference to international intervention or structures and manipulating the rules. And I think I push a little bit farther on these in this report than I think the authors did. I'm not going to go into everything, but I think one of the things that gets mentioned and dropped are ideas. The old pluralist paradigm, very important in some settings, but it doesn't necessarily capture everything that goes on. Ideas can shape that behavior very strongly. Rules outside of the system can shape that very strongly. And I think there's an understanding of this in the report, but it's not actually linked very strongly to the analysis. People vote their interests sometimes in very restricted domains. I like to think, well, yeah, in a city, where people are beholden to the behavior of the mayor, they are probably going to calculate whether that mayor, or observe, pay attention to what that mayor is doing, and calculate whether the mayor is doing what they want, whether the services are well provided. But I think once you take it beyond that level, and you're taking it to the national level, people are voting on a whole lot of different kinds of things at once. It's not a single dimension. It's often not observable to them. They don't have the information. And as we have seen recently, this is a problem. So if you're trying to get better policy out of voting, and you're trying to get better policy out of a lot of forms of collective action, I don't know that it's going to actually happen. So I'm a bit more in the Chris Aiken dimension these days, that maybe the world's a little bit more irrational than the ideas behind this report suggest. That ideas matter, that people can't calculate all the time very well, and we need to take that into account when we're trying to think about how you get improved levels of implementation. There's another dimension I thought was a little missing from the report, and this is again the political science hat, but there are transnational actors out there who have a lot of power right now. And an economist at one time described a distinction between a stationary bandit, that's the person who holds you up for your tax revenues, but is going to be like the mafia in the neighborhood, so they're going to kind of keep things cool. And then there's the roving bandit who is going to move on and is just going to kind of rob you all blind because, A, I don't have to have a nice neighborhood from which to run my protection racket. Now, that's a very pessimistic view of politics in my view. But on the other hand, this roving bandit notion right now, I think, has a lot of currency. And one of the ways in which I get very worried about roving bandits these days is when I watch American billionaires start to buy dual citizenship in other countries and buy up a lot of property there. Because what are they going to do? Things go south in the United States, they're headed out. They don't have any vested interest here anymore. You see that on a much larger scale in some other parts of the world, but I think we have to be worried about it here. So I think that dimension of this and the complications it poses for implementation are pretty severe. So I'd like to see a little bit more attention to these really, really tough problems. I guess the final thing I'd say, wearing both my program hat and my political scientist hat, is that I think there are things other than political will and the bargaining power, or bargaining among actors that do matter. I mean, I understand completely the point that the report makes and that you make about we've overplayed capacity in some senses, that you could train people up, you could have capacity, but government would still not be able to get things done because it'd be blocked in various ways. But you know, when we've spent now a lot of years out there looking at failures and successes, and particularly successes, and capacity actually does matter. It is sometimes the stumbling point. People actually have a vision and they run into a brick wall. They can't figure out how to get people on post for more than 6 months. And to run a program, you need to have people on post more than 6 months. They can't figure out how to get the skills because they all left in a civil war. So I think those capacity problems are still there. It's not purely political will that matters. And I think, in a sense, you overpitch to my home discipline. And I would say, just don't pay attention to the political scientists as much. Or at least pay attention to some earlier generation political science and maybe some things that may come back a bit. So I'm not going to take up much more time. I just wanted to make one other report. I did actually dabble in law at one point in life. And the rule of law, as the report defines it, is kind of odd from a lawyer's perspective. These were the 3 points, and I understand why they're there, but I don't think that they actually capture what we mean by the rule of law. And you then, the report shifts to role of law, and I think that made more sense for the report. But by rule of law, we're not, I guess the thing that comes closest is this, how this elite comes to accept the constraints on power. But I'm not sure the other two actually have much of a role to play in this. And so is that really what we mean by this? And I also worry that actually when law works, it's not because people know what the law is or even necessarily what that law says sometimes. It's about the prior norms that came into place that allowed people to agree on this compact, and then the ways of communicating that out to various people. So in the United States, how do most people know about the law? They know it from listening or viewing cop shows on television, and that's about it. And I remember being in the airport in Dar es Salaam once and hearing Judge Judy on the radio, and everybody was riveted to Judge Judy. It brought it home very strongly. So I think looking at the underlying norms and then how the legal norms actually get out to people makes a difference. And I suggest that these norms evolve in small communities, whether those are professional communities or actually people from different walks of life living together. So then my last comment is going to be the really nice thing that the report does, I think, is make the point that the issues it raises are not necessarily just the issues of poor countries. That the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. It doesn't say it in quite those words, but I think it's a point that comes out in some of the analysis. That governance is not just a problem for poor countries, that in fact, relatively small proportion of, say, corruption or anti-corruption problem is correlated with levels of development, and we've got that problem too. So a lot of the analysis in the report is actually possibly more useful for looking at some big countries we know about right now, close by, than it is some of the developing countries. So I'll leave it there, and Carlos wanted to make some more remarks.
Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you so much. I'm going to be very brief because I really think that we should go into the question and answer period. Let me say that I find the end of the report very fitting. There is this very short sentence where the report says that Hirschman in 1967 already told us that development is an inherently contentious process that implicates power imbalances and social norms. And I say that I find this very nice and very fitting because in a way it allows, it sort of immediately brought to me this realizing how much the literature on development and political and economic development has changed over time. And I think that for the better, with all the kinds of weaknesses that there may be, still there are lots of things, and the report talks about many things that we don't know about, and maybe we'll never know how to solve, how much it has changed. And so I asked Ezequiel at the beginning, when was the first World Development Report issued? It turns out it was 1978, so it means that I was calculating this as you were talking. This is the 40th report. And things have changed enormously. So when you think about the literature on development and the genealogy of this, you find that at the beginning, so I would call this an initial cycle, when people thought about the objectives of development and the solutions to development, the kind of a standard response was the objective is growth, and the solution were basically technical solutions, meaning thinking about governments and framing governments as benevolent social planners, that if you send economists trained in Princeton to work for them, they would find the right solutions to the problem. That was the first cycle. It was very powerful. It is still very important. I'm not denying that you need to have good technical solutions and that you should not have people knowing how to derive and all these kinds of things. But we also progressively learned that governments are not benevolent social planners. They have their own interests. They are in relationship with many other actors. They have their own incentive structures and so on, preferences and so on. So then there was this second cycle in the development literature, starting probably in the late 80s, early 90s, the Northian type of approach, where institutions became very important. It was a realization that you had to think about institutions, about the whole structure and the actors involved in these. The second cycle progressively becomes a third cycle, and you can see this in the report, when the objective now of development is not just growth, but also becomes peace and equity. Peace as a precondition for growth, this is part of the institutionalist literature, and then equity as part of the sharing of this growth, and perhaps the fact we don't know really that equity may be a precondition for growth. And so, and with that, and I think that the report, and I like the report because it introduces this very flexible understanding of institutions. It complicates things because at this point we all still quarrel about what an institution is and what are the right institutions. But the report says very directly, we are more interested in the functions that institutions play, the three functions, the three C's, than in the specific form. And the final step in this kind of, I would call the third cycle of the development literature, is the going from institutions to thinking about the underlying structures behind or below or whatever supporting institutions, and really talking about the distribution of power and importance of asymmetries in distribution of power. And in that sense, the report, with all the ambiguities that may come with this report, is a substantial feat, because by doing this, by talking about these things, you're touching the raw nerve of governments and of the problem of development, right? Because one thing is to be very technical and then all governments want you. The second thing is to be semi-technical and you talk about institutions. Governments is you. When you start talking about asymmetries in the distribution of power, then many countries don't like you. And so I invite you to go through the report and count what are the countries. I'm not involved in the report, so I can't say these things. I have tenure. What are the countries that appear in the report, and which are the countries that do not really appear? And if you start doing this, you will see a pattern. Those that do not have the right type of symmetries of power or whatever do not appear that much. Still, the report is interesting for all these things that it does and how it brings the literature to sort of incite us or sort of move us, steer some of us to debate about the conditions to have change. In that sense, at the end of the report, there is a whole part on drivers of change. And there, the report talks about elites, it talks about citizens as agents of change, and it talks about governments in an interconnected world, where I would have expected a bit more, and it does all this with a certain humility, which is, I think, also important, because the report comes to the conclusion, at least it is how I read it, that there are no fixed solutions. There are only entry points. We know what the North looks like, and we know what the South looks like, but we cannot really tell people, we know the bridge, how to build the bridge so that the South becomes the North. But we do not want to say we do not know how to get to the North, because that would not be true either, since some countries and some communities have moved in terms of, for the better, in terms of growth and in terms of equity, and so on, and so on and so forth. So I think that the report, in a way, tells us, there is a gap between the North and the South, and there are different ways of getting there. And whenever we see a chance to get to the North, just take it, grab it, and move with a boat or whatever, rowing or jumping or swimming, move to the North, right? And so I think this is important. And I'm really curious to see what has been the reaction that you have had from governments, from your audiences, about exactly have they ignored the report? Have they been shocked by the report? What has been the reaction? Let me just conclude. Besides thanking you for coming here, to say that there is, to me, an absence in the report, and which is the question of change always involves in some way winners and losers, to some extent. And there is little about how to compensate losers. I think that part of changing things is to have a vision, the Tony Blair vision, I suppose, to have the time that the Brits have had to construct, institutions, whatever, but also a sense of how to compensate those that may be losing things so that you reduce their resistance to change. And this can only be done in a kind of dynamic framework. And this is what is difficult about change, how to make sure that you increase, if you will, let me be very political, kind of a political economist, increase the pie so that you can share in the pie. Or as a colleague of mine said, whenever we talk about political economy in the US, we should not use pies, but pizzas. How to increase the pizza so that everybody can get a slice and enjoy, the result. But other than that, it's a wonderful to having had you here and collaborating with you in this project. Thank you so much. Let us open this to questions. So just raise your hands, and Luis Felipe will start shooting back,
And Ezequiel as well.
Or Ezequiel, of course.
Perhaps I should just read the report for this, but one thing that was mentioned, which was very interesting to me, is the role of international agencies and international actors to redistribute the balance of power, perhaps, or change the rules of the game. And I'm wondering if you have examples of how that has happened successfully and unsuccessfully in sort of the recent cycle of macro state interventions.
Recent cycle
of interventions or of policy consultations.
Then take a few. No?
We take a couple more, and then we may want to answer them.
Yes, hello, my name is Oscar. I'm a second year MPD student here. My question is partly informed. I come from Colombia, and it's partly informed by that, and it has to do with something that Professor Widener mentioned it's the relation between central government and like the regions within a country, and how like the interactions of like the law and the governance that is implemented, or the governance systems that are sort of created in the center, like how do they actually like relate to what happens in the regions of a country. And I'm asking, particularly informed by the fact that these negotiations also happen between that like center and those regions in a way, and in many cases, say for example in the case of Colombia, many non-state actors emerge surrounding that are both, let's say, legal actors, but also like armed illegal actors. So, yeah.
Why don't you answer these two questions plus the question of
Yeah.
what is the reaction that you
Right.
have got from
Okay, so thank you very much for all the comments, and let's try to be efficient so we get more questions. So something on two comments on your very rich comments. One is related to the role of. I think the report it is true, and we acknowledge that the report talks very little about private international actors. So when we talk about international actors, we're basically referring to multinational, multilateral financial institutions and so on. And there was a discussion about that. There was a decision not to get into that, not because it was not important, but it was already a very long report. But there is one element only that we mentioned, which is the spotlight on illicit financial flows. So there are two things. One is when we talk about the idea of avoiding races to the bottom, and how coordination of countries can help prevent this type of, as you were saying, how being stronger against non-state actors who are basically playing a game. And the other is one specific example is the illicit financial flows, in which basically states become very weak if there is no coordination, because people can move the money around and so on. But it's true, there is a deficit there. And the second, the rule of law, I think the way we try to define the rule of law is just like, I think the UN very standard way, which is rule of law is when when the rules are applied impersonally, when the rulers are also subject to the law, to the rules, and then we try to we have this box written by Fukuyama on transitions to the rule of law, where we say basically try to understand why. According to Frank, the idea is that we understand better transitions to democracy, and there is a lot of work on transitions to democracy, but we understand less how countries transition to the rule of law. I think that is the point we wanted to make, and argue that if you understand better the different roles of law, and you strengthen the different roles of law, you may be moving in the direction of more, into this aspirational goal of the rule of law. In terms of the reaction of actors, I would say, so within the bank, very briefly, there were the reaction of the bank, our colleagues, and there was a lot of discussion, because in a way it changes the way a lot of the work that it is done by the bank. So the bank basically traditionally works with governance as government, and a lot related to form. So this idea that we try to incorporate a little bit more this understanding of the different power symmetries and the trajectories is not something that is simple to bring into the everyday work. So we're still trying to work on that, and the bank has now a team working on how these ideas can actually be brought into the operationalization. But for example, I give you one example of implications of this way of thinking, is this discussion of, the bank always has bundled financial resources with knowledge. So basically, you say, okay, you have a loan and we have technical assistance, and we generate knowledge, and we interact with the government. One of the things that we're thinking as a result of the report is we may want to unbundle. So the idea is that the knowledge and the information that the bank generates the bank should make a better effort to try to bring this knowledge and information to all actors in society, so the quality of the policy debate is enhanced, and not only trying to bring the knowledge to one of the actors, which typically actually is the incumbent in the political arena. So the idea that we want to try to be more, even though of course resources have to go to the government in place, knowledge and information have to be much more widely spread out through all the actors. So this is just one example of the type of implications that this could have. In terms of, when we are talking about how our principals in the bank reacted, I could say that, when we went to the board, 2/3 of the board were very supportive. 1/3 of the board were not so supportive. I think there's no problem that I mentioned this. There is no press. So, for example, in the case of the BRICS, it was interesting because they tend to vote together. To have common positions. In this case, actually, Brazil was very, very supportive of the report. South Africa was very supportive of the report. Other BRICS were not so supportive of the report, but so it was. It was very interesting to see the dynamics in terms of. The statements at the board were in a way a reflection of some of the things that we were saying in the report. And then when we go to present in the countries, sometimes when we went to Europe and we went to we launched the report in France and then we went to Sweden and Norway and so on. It's really a very warm welcome of this type of discussion, and it's good that the bank is talking about this. When we go to developing countries, I find two things. One is yes, there is this concern about is the bank violating the mandate, the articles of there is a very important discussion about that. There was a specific statement at the board from the legal counsel saying, giving an interpretation of why these doesn't violate the articles of agreement, because articles of agreement say the bank should not interfere in politics, which is a very context-specific thing, no? So there is always this issue whether the bank is moving too much into the political arena, but I think what we're saying, that's why you always say the mandate of the bank is about policy effectiveness, and in order to be more policy effective, which is our mandate, we want to understand all these other issues. But we went, for example, to a North African country in which the government said, okay, we don't want to have a public presentation of the report, but we would like to sit down with you closed doors and discuss, because we're concerned about certain issues, about radicalization of youth, so we would like to discuss with you how we can do specific challenges that we have. So we sat down in a room for a full day with the Prime Minister, 6 cabinet members. There was no public event, but it was a very interesting discussion. So I think the reaction is very heterogeneous. It shows in a way some of the realities of the governance in a specific country. So it's interesting that it has become a little bit of a tailored type of presentation in each country, because we want to go as far as the context allows us to go. But it's true that as opposed to other reports, this has to be carefully managed in terms of the public messages. Yeah.
I'm troubled by what I hear as a lot of stories of institutions and groups trying to help others, World Bank being one, and hearing stories such as Greece needs help, so we'll give help to Greece. Or it could be on personal level actors to drug addicts, or pick any group you want. And when we try to find a way to help, we have a good instinct to do that. All religions teach us to do that. And at the same time, life tells us, but don't be played by these people. They might just take your money and run, kind of thing. So we always have to put a protection on it. It seems to me sometimes that the protections that we put on it are so restrictive that instead of getting gratitude and good behavior from the people who we are trying to assist, we get the opposite. And I don't know, maybe if in the cases of such things as Greece or other, we hear a lot of turmoil, how they don't like it, they don't want it, no, it's not working. Is that just media static, or is this kind of thing working? I feel that I see it around me every day in my own life of how we have to protect ourselves against whoever. And I think we sometimes many times, are shooting ourselves in the foot. How's it working?
Let's take another
Another question.
perhaps, if you don't mind.
Could you perhaps clarify one of the last slides about the foreign investment area? Because that seems that might be contradictory to if you take it as an issue policy area and just consider that, because you have the international treaties that only states can sign, yet you give benefits to foreign investors, and they are the ones that can sue at exit, and it's only a one-way thing. So how do you integrate that with what you said earlier?
I think this is related to the comment I made before, that we talk mainly about interventions at the international level by multilateral organizations like, World Bank and development assistance and so on. So there is little in the report about the role of private international actors. So there is some discussion, brief discussion in chapter 9 on foreign investment, and we talk about how to create these multi-stakeholder commissions for example, for extractives and these type of elements. But indeed, what was just mentioned before is important in terms of how you avoid it's not like we don't talk about that, but I think the framework helps you understand that, in the sense that if the instrument strengthens the bargaining power of the non-state actor versus the state actor, that has an implication, and you have to understand that aspect, and try to see if you want to change it. So in a way, it allows you to understand that. The same thing with the decentralization element that was mentioned before. I think there was a lot of pressure. For decentralization during the 90s and so on, and there was little understanding of whether the idea of capture and so on was more likely at the local level. And now the idea is precisely to rethink when you have to understand with this framework whether when you are decentralizing without creating the accountability mechanisms at the local level, you may actually opening the door for more capture locally. There's one spotlight that I recommend that you take a look at, which is on what we call ungoverned spaces, where we basically say that there is no such thing as ungoverned spaces. What you have actually is that ungoverned spaces really, at the end, becomes spaces where non-state actors basically take the control of the territory, and the idea is how you can recover that control. And I think the case of Colombia is interesting because it would be difficult to understand the peace process without looking at the previous effort of the state to try to regain presence throughout the territory. Otherwise, the commitment for the peace would not be credible. So the idea that, maybe 15 years ago or even 10 years ago, a peace process would not have been feasible because the commitment wouldn't be credible. Now, with the state regaining the control on the territory, then the peace process became sort of a more credible strategy. But I think the deficit about private sector internationally is something that we have to acknowledge. But I would claim that the framework allows you to understand those type of problems, even though we don't discuss them in depth. Oh yes. That, I think, if I understand correctly, I think one of the elements on that is that it's related to this idea that the outcomes and the change can only come from agreements among domestic actors. So it's difficult to think that you can bring about change from the outside. So I think we insist on that, and then the idea that through the different interventions, it can be a bailout, or it can be foreign aid, or it can be technical assistance, or it can be international treaties. You are basically influencing the relative bargaining power of some domestic actors. But you are not necessarily imposing the objectives or the preferences. So at the end, if you understand whose bargaining power is that you are strengthening through your intervention, you can have a better understanding of where the situation could go. but it's difficult to try to be more, what we claim is that it's not possible to be deterministic about bringing the outcome from the outside. And that's why the process, that's why in a way we cannot be prescriptive. So the process can be very chaotic, as you were saying, and it could go in many directions if the agreements among the local actors are not sustainable, or if their goals are inconsistent with the goals of what you would like to achieve from the outside. But still, you want to use certain instruments to try to influence that bargaining process.
Okay, I think there are, you're going to the last round of questions, and then we'll end there. If you, yeah.
Hi, my name is Ladi. I'm an MPA 1 here from Lagos, Nigeria. I quickly just wanted to push back against the idea that recipients of development assistance ought to express gratitude, because it kind of assumes that there is no political logic behind why nations behave the way they do in the context of international organizations. That I believe that interventions in foreign economies is driven by the ultimate goal of advancing national interests. So to expect poor countries in Africa, for example, to be thankful to donor countries is not something that I want to welcome, because there is a reason why it's a strategic act. Giving aid, giving assistance is a strategic act, and it's not an act of benevolence, and so we shouldn't expect a return of gratitude on that gesture. Just wanted to put that.
Let's take your question and then your question. I will read that. Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Jaime. I'm from Mexico. I'm a second-year student here at the Woodrow Wilson. When reading, to be honest, I just read the executive summary of the report, and coupling it with your presentation, it felt, and it rings a lot of bells, particularly with what's happening in Mexico, with the new administration, 2012-2013. A broad spectrum of structural reforms were presented, something that had been on the pipeline for years. They were approved. A lot of people thought that this was the time when Mexico would sort of like graduate in their development track. But then with the implementation and the little details, it felt like it drained down the implementation. And now I would like to hear what you think, particularly in the case of Mexico, but generally when this like broad reforms with the support of multilateral institutions are presented. I think it's the details and the nitty-gritty when the conflict of interest and people can start bargaining for their own benefits.
Okay, the last question.
As for drivers of change, where are the entry points for education?
Okay. That's an excellent question for Ezequiel. So I will respond this too. So in the first one, I think we're in full agreement. I don't see any disagreement there. What we're saying precisely is that international actors have an objective when they provide or use certain instruments, for example, development assistance. And our only point is that objective cannot be achieved if it's not consistent with the goals and the agreements reached by the domestic actors. This is precisely what we're saying. So what we say is if you reinforce an equilibrium that is leading to an outcome that is not what you would like to support, it's very unlikely that you will change the situation. So basically the idea is think of what instrument you are using, whose bargaining power you are strengthening through the intervention, and see whether this is consistent with the strategic goal of the intervention. So I think we're in full agreement. We're not. What we're saying precisely is that change can only come from agreements reached in the local, in the domestic arena, and international actors can only play a role by using different instruments to try to change the relative power in that domestic arena. But at the end, they are also pursuing strategic goals. So I think we're in full agreement there. On the Mexico element, two things. One is, one of the examples that we show is that in Latin America in general, I would, make a broader point. So it's not about Mexico. I think in Latin America, it seems to be happening, and it will take time to see whether this is consolidated, is that the tolerance to corruption has changed. So, and we associated, we cannot claim that this is causal, but the fact that you have a middle class that has been strengthened in the last 15 years and so on. So you have, because it's interesting that you have in Chile, in Mexico, in Brazil, in Colombia, in many other places, in Central America, very important movements against corruption, and civil society organized, trying to ask for better institutions and for better laws to constrain corruption. So I think, in general, I would say that this is, the reforms and so on is part of the development, the tensions created by the development process that we mentioned. But I think an interesting and potentially positive development is that there seems to be an important change in society's tolerance to corruption, which could be a positive thing. Ezequiel, would you like to say something about education?
Yes. So I think what we are saying in the application to education of the framework, and I should also say that the next report that is coming is on education.
Yeah, the next one will be education.
So you will have a whole report on that. But what we can say from the framework is that first we need to understand the actual problem, that any country is facing. Say, education in the U.S. may have very different problems than education in Kenya. It's not the same. Not having, for example, in Mozambique, 1 out of 2 teachers don't show up to the school when they are supposed to. So the problem that you have there is going to be very difficult, very different to solve. That the problem that the teacher is there, but he doesn't master the content knowledge, or he's there and doesn't know how to perform the teaching practices that would take kids to learn the material he's supposed to be covering. But for example, one example that we use in the report that Felipe mentioned is the case of Kenya. So there have been a lot of randomized control trials, and people use these experiments to try to show which would be the best policy that you could do in certain scenarios. And in the case of Kenya, they show that if you put contract teachers, you are going to improve not only presence of the teacher but also student outcomes. And this was shown to be the case in some schools in Kenya. But when the government tried to actually scale this up and actually recruit teachers to be contract teachers, this actually didn't pay off, because in these government schools, the new contract teachers knew that the government couldn't commit to fire them if they didn't go to school. So in the end, they just didn't went to school. Outcomes didn't improve, and that goes to show that things that we learn from an RCT that would be the gold standard in trying to understand what works and what doesn't may not be extrapolated to an actual policy, because you need to understand which are the actors that have power in this context. So maybe, and I think that example, we put it on the same chapter. We have an example in Chile where, rather than confronting with the unions, the government tried to agree with the unions in how they can improve both teacher compensation and at the same time an evaluation process for teachers to improve student outcomes. And that shows rather than trying to impose a solution for which they didn't have power to sustain it.
All right, and with this I think we are done at 6 o'clock. And so thank you so much for coming and presenting.
Thank you very
report.
much.
And thank you, John.
Thank you.